Hey guys, here we are at chapter 26. It says phylogeny and the tree of life. Chapter 26 will be the last chapter that's covered on exam 1. I believe that's chapters 22 through 26. So there are about 5 chapters that'll be on exam 1. Exam 1 will be approximately 50 questions, so you can expect approximately 10 questions per chapter. Chapter 26 here is fairly heavy on the vocabulary, so I would suggest Quizlet or some of the other tools that are heavy on vocabulary. Looking at the chapter summaries would be a good idea, as well as, of course, listening to whatever vodcasts or video presentations that I provide, as well as using your textbook, of course, and you can always email me if you have any questions. So chapter 26, we're going to talk a little bit about how humans try to make sense of biology. If you'll recall, many times I've said biology is very gray. It's very messy as far as science goes, not nearly as clean-cut and precise as the mathematics of physics or the clean-cut formulas of chemistry. So a lot of people tend to shy away from biology because of this. I personally embrace it. I really like the fact that it's kind of a messy science, and particularly the fact that we are learning so much and so many new things about genetics and biology and the advances in some of the molecular sciences that relate to biology. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we have tried to make sense of all of this over time, how we have classified and categorized all the various living creatures. Humans, if nothing else, are very much pattern seekers, and so we try to categorize and put into boxes everything around us in the world so we can better understand it, and we have done that with biology as well. So again, chapter 26, phylogeny and the tree of life, and we'll get started in just 1 second. We're going to start right here with this little guy. He's kind of cute. So what is this guy? What is this organism? He obviously looks to me like a snake, but we're going to find out he is not a snake. He's actually a type of legless lizard, an Australian legless lizard known as the common scalyfoot. And there are many of these legless lizards all around the world. This one happens to be from Australia. So when we look at this creature, what makes it not a snake? I mean, why would it not fit into the snake category? And how do scientists decide what type of category a creature like this belongs to? Because certainly if you just saw it slithering through the grass, you would call it a snake. So what makes it a lizard as opposed to a snake, and how do people decide which category all these various creatures go into? That's what we're going to take a look at. Here's our overview, investigating the tree of life. Our overview says an understanding of evolutionary relationships suggests one way to address these questions. We can decide into which container, so to speak, to place a species by comparing its trait with those of potential close relatives. For example, the scaly foot that we just saw on the previous page does not have a fused eyelid, a highly mobile jaw, or a short tail posterior to the anus. Those are all 3 traits shared by all snakes, and it has none of those traits, so it doesn't fall into the category of snake. These and other characteristics suggest that despite a superficial resemblance, the scalyfoot is not a snake. It is indeed a legless lizard. And believe it or not, legless lizards have evolved independently in several different groups over time in different parts of the world. In this unit, chapter 26, we're going to survey the diversity we see around us in the living world and describe hypotheses regarding how it evolved. And as we do so, our emphasis will shift from the process of evolution. In the last few chapters, we've been talking about the various evolutionary mechanisms, or how this occurs, and now we're going to start looking more about the pattern. What are the various observations of the products of evolution that we see over time? This chapter is very heavy on vocabulary, so you'll see a lot of underlined words, and we'll discuss a lot of vocabulary terms. And again, a tool like Quizlet would probably help you out in recalling or remembering some of these vocabulary terms. The first one is phylogeny, and phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species or group of related species. And we study phylogeny using a very systematic method. The discipline of systematics classifies organisms and determines their evolutionary relationships. And systematicists, that's a difficult word to say, systematicists, which would be the people who study this or work in this field, they use a lot of different kinds of data. They use as much evidence as they can find from as many variety of sources as they can find. And that would include fossil data, molecular data, genetic data, to infer these evolutionary relationships. And then this information is enabling biologists to construct a tree of all life, or a diagram of all life. And they will continue to refine this as additional data are collected. Again, this is all about the process of science, which means we have a model of reality, and that model is based on the evidence around us, and then as we learn new evidence, we refine and redefine that model to best match what we see and what we know. Here's an example that we're going to refer back to later on in the chapter, and it shows basically what they're calling an unexpected family tree. It shows a tulip, a mushroom, and a human, and it says what are the evolutionary relationships between the three of these. A phylogeny based on DNA data actually reveals that despite appearances, animals, which would of course include humans, and fungi, including the mushrooms, are more closely related to each other than either is to plants. So while it seems difficult to believe that a mushroom is more closely related to you than it is to a tulip, that is indeed the case based on DNA evidence and the phylogeny of what we're going to study coming up as part of this chapter. We're going to start right here with concept 26.1. It says phylogenies show evolutionary relationships. And it says, as we discussed in chapter 22, organisms share homologous characteristics because of common ancestry. As a result, we can learn a great deal about a species if we know its evolutionary history. Most creatures who are closely related to one another tend to share a lot of characteristics, and those characteristics can be morphology, like the shape of the body or particular parts of the body, or they can be molecular, relating to DNA and genetics, and we're actually going to look at both. The scientific discipline of taxonomy is the order, division, and naming of organisms. So taxonomy is primarily what this chapter is all about. How do we as humans take the information about the living world around us and try to make sense of it, try to classify it, and group creatures in a way that makes logical sense, makes logical order. So that is called taxonomy, and that's going to be our primary focus. We're going to start with understanding what binomial nomenclature is. Most people in their daily lives don't use the scientific terms for naming creatures around in the world around you. You probably wouldn't call a rose anything other than a rose. You wouldn't call it by its scientific name, or certainly most people don't describe, when someone asks you, do you have a pet at home, you probably just say dog or cat or guinea pig. You probably don't give the genus and species name. And while those common names are useful for everyday conversation, they can lead to quite a bit of confusion, and we need quite a bit more specificity when we're talking in the world of science and science circles. For example, you may call, there's a little bug that can get into your old papers and books in your library that's called a silverfish. And so it has the word fish in it, but it's not related at all to the fish in the ocean. And then we have in the ocean starfish. Once again, it has the word fish in it, but again, they're no relation to the fish, or no close relation, I should say, to the fish that you see in the ocean. So common names, like if I describe a rose, there are so many varieties of roses that it really doesn't help you out in a scientific sense. So this was noticed long before our present day. Way back in the 17 and 1800s, there was a particular scientist, a botanist named Carolus Linnaeus, who became very well known because he developed this system of naming living creatures that we still use today, called binomial nomenclature. In the 18th century, Linnaeus published a system of taxonomy based on physical resemblances, morphology, which really in his time that's all you could base it on. They didn't, of course, have genetic or DNA data. So he was just basing it on what the creature looks like, and it turns out that's a pretty darn good way of doing it for the most part. While much has changed since the time of Linnaeus, two key features of his system remain useful today, and we still use them. First is the two-part names for the species. That's the binomial nomenclature we're talking about. And the second is his hierarchical classification, putting things in a specific order, a nested order. We'll take a look at that as well. The two-part scientific name that you're probably familiar with of a species is called a binomial. The first part of the name is the genus, which is the group above the particular species. And the second part is called the specific epithet. That's the unique for each species within that genus. The first letter of the genus is capitalized, and the entire species name is italicized. Both of those words together are what we call the species. So not just the last part. So with humans, for example, our species is Homo sapien. We are in the genus Homo, and the epithet for us is sapien, but that sapien is not the species name. Altogether, those two make up the species name. So this is the example of how you would write it and say it. Capitalized genus and italicized for all. Homo sapien, that is the genus and species that describes human beings. The second major thing that Linnaeus did that we still put to use today in biology is this hierarchical classification system. Basically, he developed a way for grouping species in increasingly broad categories. Like you may start out with the single species, and then you would go out to the genus, and then from there up and up and up and up until eventually you encompassed all living creatures. The taxonomic groups from most broad to most narrow are domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And there's a lot of mnemonics you can use to kind of remember this. The one that I always use is, do koalas prefer candy or fruit, generally speaking? And if you take the first letter of each of those, do koalas prefer candy or fruit, generally speaking, you get domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. That's starting with the most broad category and going down to the most specific or smallest category. A taxonomic unit, at any level of the hierarchy is called a taxon. So a phylum is a taxon, and a species is a taxon, and an order is a taxon. Any particular level, a taxonomic unit at any of these levels can be called a taxon, just as a general name for that grouping. One thing to keep in mind is when you get up to the broader taxa, which is plural for taxon, they're not really comparable between the lineages. For example, it says an order of snails has less genetic diversity than an order of mammals. So you can look at an order of one grouping versus an order of another, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there are, say, an equal number of creatures in each order, or that they are equally as diverse, or they have an equal amount of genetic information. It's simply a grouping, a way of putting them into a structured class or set of categories so that we can understand them. Here's a good illustrated example taken straight from your textbook. Starting at the largest category and then moving your way up to the most specific, we would have the domains. We have the 3 domains of life, including bacteria, eukarya, and archaea. Eukarya would be pretty much all the creatures that you normally think of. Inside the domain eukarya, we're going to look at the kingdom Animalia. That would include you and me and cows and dogs. And then we go to the phylum Chordata, which means they have a spinal cord. And then Mammalia, which is mammals, have hair, produce milk, give live birth. The order is Carnivora, which is a meat eater of some kind. Family, I'm not sure how to pronounce this one. It's a cat family, so it's Felidae or Felidae. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. That would be the cats, like everything from house cats to lions. And then the genus is Panthera. And then this particular species, that one creature, is defined as Panthera pardus. So notice that if you have studied biology for any time at all, especially if you talk to your parents when they study biology, they may not have even known or studied these domains, because that is a fairly new addition. The addition of the domain taxa is relatively recent. We're talking 1990, basically introduced by a scientist named Carl Woese. And we introduced this lower domain because at one time archaea and bacteria were all just lumped together. But it turns out that they're not really very much alike, and the archaea actually tend to be more like some of the eukarya than the bacteria. So we divided that up into the 3 domains, and then we put on top of that the various kingdoms and went from there. Notice that the placement of species into orders, classes, etc. does not necessarily reflect evolutionary history. So when we look at some of these others, we don't mean necessarily that one followed the other. It's just a way of classifying them, grouping them to get down to that one single creature. So what we want to do is we want to try to link classification, like just looking at those basic groupings there, everything from domain all the way to species, and we want to relate that to phylogeny. We want to relate that to the actual evolutionary history or path that nature took to get to the creatures that we see today. So these scientists, systematists, wow, man, that's a tough one, systematists, depict evolutionary relationships in something called a phylogenetic tree, and you've probably seen numerous examples of these phylogenetic trees. Sometimes changes to the groupings are made as new information comes to light, and this has really happened, say, in the last 30 or 40 years because of all the new genetic data and information that we now know. And while the older Linnaean system may distinguish groups such as mammals, reptiles, birds, and other classes of vertebrates, it doesn't really do a lot to tell us about the evolutionary relationships of one of these groupings to another. So what we want to try to do is take not just a classification, but develop that in some way so that we can see a pathway that evolution and natural selection has taken to get to where we are today. So here we're kind of combining two things. We're combining the Linnaean classification. We have order and family, genus and species, but we're doing it in a way with the phylogenetic tree that shows relationships, and it shows one species, how it originated and how it had a common ancestor with another species. So we can see way back here at the order here that this particular species of leopard has a common ancestor with all these other creatures, but that was way back at this point here. The common ancestor was quite some time ago. And then we see these four are more closely related to each other because their common ancestor is not as far back. And then we see that these two, the badger and the otter, are even more closely related to each other. And from another branch we can see the dog family, this coyote and the gray wolf. You can see that they are fairly closely related to one another. So here you can see not just the various classifications of order, family, genus, and species, but you can start to see phylogeny. You can start to see evolutionary relationships and pathways between all these different species. Partially because we have so much more new data as it relates to DNA and genetics. Sometimes now the Linnaean classification and the true phylogeny differ from one another. It's pretty amazing that for the most part the Linnaean classification, just based on body, on morphology, has for the most part been accurate and been true. We have some examples now where creatures where we thought they were fairly closely related to one another because they looked a lot alike or some other characteristic. Turns out when you look at their DNA, they're not as closely related as we thought, and we talked earlier about convergent evolution and other things that could cause that. So because of this, because sometimes there are differences between the true phylogeny and the Linnaean, the old classification, some scientists have proposed what they call a phylocode, which recognizes only groups that include a common ancestor and all its descendants based only on evolutionary relationships. For example, if we were going to use a phylocode to discuss birds and reptiles and the like, we would have to make some changes because currently the class of aves is birds, and it's its own class separate from reptilia, which would be all the reptiles. Well, if we're going to look at simply the evolutionary relationships, then we would probably need to change that, and we would need to make the current class of aves as a subgroup under the current class of reptilia, because birds evolved from a group of reptiles. So there are some changes that you can make, and you're going to see that this whole idea of taxonomy is it's a human creation. So it's something that can be tweaked and something that a lot of scientists kind of move around, and as we learn more we do change it. It's not something that's static and set in stone. Remember, it's just a way for humans to try to understand and make sense of the biological world around them. What that means is a phylogenetic tree is simply another type of hypothesis. It's a hypothesis about evolutionary relationships, and as any hypothesis in science, it can be tested and it can be perhaps strengthened by evidence, or it can even be discarded if enough evidence piles up against it. So keep that in mind. A phylogenetic tree is simply another version of a scientific hypothesis, and in some cases these various divisions and trees are considered pretty darn strong because they have held up with massive amounts of evidence, and in other cases we've made changes like the addition of the domains at the very bottom of the tree. So we want to take a look at some vocabulary, because when we look at these phylogenetic trees there are some basic vocabulary terms that apply to all of them. One of those is the word branch point, or the definition of branch point. A branch point represents the divergence of two species from a common ancestor, and I'm going to look at a picture, show you a picture as well. So here would be a branch point. A branch point is any point where lineages diverge, and so you have this entire group and this entire group. If you back up, this is a branch point where they shared a common ancestor. This is a branch point, this is a branch point. These are just places where the lineages diverge and go at least two separate ways. The next term for us to look at is called sister taxa. Remember, taxa is just plural for taxon, and taxon is simply one of the groupings at one particular level. So sister taxa are groups that share an immediate common ancestor and hence are each other's closest relative. So in our example here, taxon B and taxon C are sister taxa. They share a common relative, they share a common ancestor, and so they are, between these taxons, between A through G, they are most closely related to each other. B is most closely related to C than it is to any other taxon letter that you see on the chart. Another term to consider is a rooted tree. A rooted tree includes a branch to represent the last common ancestor of all the taxa shown in the tree. That's usually going to be to the far left or the lowest point, depending on how the tree is drawn. In this case, we are looking at what you would call a rooted tree because it shows a single line starting point. This would be the last common ancestor for all of the taxon that's shown on this chart. So at this point, this is the last common ancestor that eventually leads to all of these taxons that you see. Two more terms. A basal taxon. Basal is meaning base or close to the base or the beginning. A basal taxon diverges early in the history of a group and originates near the common ancestor of the group. In this case, taxon G is a basal taxon. See how it originates well back in time, very close to the original common ancestor. So that would be a basal taxon. Its origination point is well back toward the beginning. You could consider, if you were comparing this one, G is the most basal taxon, but then you could consider some of these further back in time as well, but this would be the best example of a basal taxon. Last term is a polytomy. A polytomy, or polytomy, is a branch from which more than two groups emerge, and what this means is we're not really sure yet. If you see a branching point where more than two groups emerge, that signifies that the evolutionary relationship at that point is not yet clear. So basically that means this is the best we know at the moment, and in the chart that would be like, for example, right here, you should pretty much always prefer to see only two possibilities. So you should see basically two branching points from every place where it diverges. If you see more than that, you would call that a polytomy, and that would be basically a point where we're not quite sure, because between taxon D, E, and F, there's probably a point further along where one splits off and we should have two and then another split, but instead this is yet unclear. So it's an unresolved pattern of divergence, and this is as close as we know at the moment, is basically what it says. Now, a phylogenetic tree, remember, is a tool. It's a man-made tool, and with any model in science, you have some positive aspects and some negative aspects. You have some drawbacks to it, and then some strengths, and some things where it doesn't do the good job, or as good a job as we would like. So what can we learn, and what can we not learn about using phylogenetic trees? First off, you need to know that phylogenetic trees show patterns of descent. They don't necessarily show phenotypic similarity. So what that means is, although closely related organisms often look similar, of course due to common ancestry, they may not due to a variety of reasons, differing evolutionary paths, differing amounts of genetic change over time, environmental aspects. A good example of this is crocodiles are more closely related to birds than they are to lizards, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Crocodiles actually have a lot in common with birds, and they are more closely related to birds than to lizards, but if you were to ask just a random person on a street, they would probably say that crocodiles and lizards are more closely related simply because they seem to look more like each other. Now, they are not, but that shows you how just because the creatures look alike, that doesn't mean they're closely related. And if they are fairly closely related, that doesn't mean necessarily they will look alike. At the very beginning of the chapter, remember I said a mushroom is more closely related to a human than it is to a plant. Well, that would probably not be most people's guess. So this shows you that the phylogenetic tree shows you a pattern of descent. It doesn't necessarily mean that you look the same or that there's any phenotypic similarity. Second, on most phylogenetic trees, there's no indication of when a species evolved or how much change occurred in a lineage. There's generally not a time frame or a year associated with this, generally unless given specific information about what the branch links mean or how that's related to time. For example, we are going to talk about some later on where the branch length is proportional to time, but for the most part that's not the case. We shouldn't interpret the diagram solely in terms of, we should interpret the diagram solely in terms of patterns of descent. You shouldn't make any guesses about time frame, or no assumptions should be made about when a particular species evolved or how much change occurred. For the most part with a phylogenetic tree, it's simply showing you a relationship. It's not showing you a time scale or anything like that. And the third thing to be aware of is a phylogenetic tree, you should not assume that a taxon evolved from the taxon next to it. That's generally not how it works. Say for example, if we look at this chart, we have the wolf and the coyote. You shouldn't assume that the wolf evolved from the coyote or the coyote evolved from the wolf. That's not really the way it works. The only thing that we can infer is that the lineage leading to wolves and coyotes held a common ancestor, and that would be at the red dot here. So at this point there was a common ancestor that eventually branched off and led to the coyote and branched off and led to the wolf. That ancestor, which is now extinct because it doesn't have a line coming out, it was neither a coyote nor a wolf. This red dot representing the common ancestor was not a coyote and it was not a wolf. It was something else. However, its descendants include two extant living species here, the coyote and the wolf. So you wouldn't say that one came from the other, much like sometimes I hear people make the misconception or the misunderstanding that evolution says, humans evolved from chimpanzees. Well, that's totally incorrect. No currently living species evolved from another currently living species. They perhaps diverged at one point and shared a common ancestor, and that's what this is showing here as well. Let's wrap up this section by talking about how we can apply phylogenies. How can we make use of this information? So one good example that they use in the textbook is providing important information about similar characteristics in closely related species. And the example in the textbook is, via DNA study, we have found two wild grasses that are likely the closest living relatives to our common corn that we raise on the farm for animal consumption and human consumption. And that means what we basically found the two closest living relatives to corn, and so we can use those living relatives as potential further study in the lab, maybe even potential crossbreeding or genetic engineering with the corn that we now have to perhaps introduce alleles that might be beneficial or something like that. So that's one way of applying phylogeny, is determining important information about the variety of creatures and their characteristics and who are their most closely related species and that type of thing. And then they use a second example in the textbook where phylogeny was used to identify a particular species, and in this case some scientists were buying whale meat from a Japanese meat market, and there are only certain species of whales that are legal to hunt, but when you bought the whale meat it was just in a slab. You would have no idea what type of whale it came from. So what they did is they took samples of the whale meat that they bought in the market, and 6 of these samples it turned out to be most closely related to species that were not legal to harvest. So they were looking at some of these various samples that they bought, and many of these unknowns happened to best fit with a variety of whales that should have been illegal to harvest. So that was a way of kind of identifying where that meat came from and whether or not it was legal or illegal to sell. Alright, so we're going to stop right there. That's a little bit about phylogeny, which is evolutionary relationships, and then a bit of introduction about taxonomy, which is the science of categorizing things, which humans love to do. We're going to get started back up with Concept 26.2, and we'll talk about the information, data, and evidence for all of this that we're talking about, and we'll take a break, come right back.